The call nobody was supposed to make. Damascus, 2013. A city older than empires, older than borders, older than war itself, and yet engulfed in a darkness that felt newer than anything humanity had ever seen. The night hung heavy over the capital like smoke trapped beneath a lid, polluted by the low thrum of distant artillery, and the anxious electricity of a nation suffocating under the weight of its own secrets. The streets around the presidential district were silent in a way that didn't feel natural. It felt engineered, controlled, designed to hide something. At 2:11 a.m., a coded transmission from Langley lit up the secure channel of a forward-deployed SEAL team operating out of Jordan. No introduction, no context, just a single directive. Operation Sable. Wheels up in 22 minutes. No one asked questions. Operators who survive long enough learn that some orders are heavy enough to kill curiosity on arrival. Cody name, Raven 6. The team was led by Lieutenant Mason Hawley, 12 years in the teams, a man who spoke little and listened too well. His face was carved with the kind of stillness that only forms when someone carries things they can never talk about. When he read the transmission, he didn't blink. He just handed it to his second-in-command, nodded once, and began the quiet ritual of preparing for a mission that didn't exist. Only when they were inside the dim belly of a blacked-out Much 47 did the second transmission arrive. This time with the full weight of what was being asked. Primary objective: breach the presidential complex in Damascus. Secondary: remove asset Hiran. Tertiary: no U.S. signature. For several seconds, no one on the aircraft spoke. Even the rotor blades seemed to hesitate. Assad's palace wasn't just a building. It was a fortress, a labyrinth of reinforced walls, underground panic rooms, decoy chambers, and layered anti-air systems designed to wipe intruders off the map before they crossed Syrian airspace. Nobody, not the CIA, not Mossad, not even Russia, knew the full layout of the palace. It was a dead zone inside a deadlier zone. But the message contained one final line, and that line demanded obedience. Window of vulnerability: 12 minutes. 12 minutes. To infiltrate one of the most guarded buildings in the Middle East. To locate an asset hidden somewhere inside a palace built to survive coup attempts, invasions, and chemical strike. To extract without a trace. To exit Syrian airspace before the Russians detected the intrusion. The operators exchanged glances that held no fear, only calculation. 12 minutes wasn't a timeline. It was an accusation. If you hesitate, if you misjudge, if you miss a single detail, you die. As the helicopter approached the Syrian border, the crew chief cut the interior lights. Darkness swallowed the cabin. The only sounds were breathing slow, heavy, controlled, and the muted metallic clicks of weapons being checked a final time. Hole studied the topographic map projected in faint infrared. The palace perched on a hillside, wrapped in overlapping kill zones like a spider cocooned in its own web. Then came the unexpected. A third transmission marked Eyes Only Team Leader. Halle opened it, read it, closed it, and for the first time in years, someone saw him hesitate. Not in fear, but in the kind of silent processing reserved for orders that cross the line between dangerous and impossible. When his second asked what it said, Hollis simply replied, "Asset Heron is alive, but he won't be for long." Nobody asked anything else. The pilots dropped altitude to Tarinmask, the aircraft from Syrian radar, weaving through valleys and across pitch-black ravines. The city grew beneath them, lights flickering in and out, pockets of explosions glowing faintly like dying stars. Damascus was ancient, but that night it felt like something predatory. Watching, listening. At 3:04 a.m., the team reached the insertion point. 12 minutes. No backup. No signature. No margin. The kind of mission you only get once, because there's no guarantee you'll get another. And the palace waited in the dark, unaware that a storm was about to carve its way through the heart of Damascus. The insertion point was nothing more than a barren strip of rock near the southwestern bluff of Damascus. A slope so jagged and uninviting that no patrol bothered to check it. The MH-47 hovered low enough that dust rose in spirals, and the SEALs fast-roped into the darkness with a precision that made the entire act look rehearsed, almost choreographed, except for the weight everyone carried in their chest. There are missions you execute, and missions you enter. This was the second kind. The kind that unsettles something primal inside even the most experienced operator. With boots on the ground, the helicopter vanished as quickly as it had arrived, melting back into the black sky like a shadow unplugged from reality. Silence rushed in. Not the natural silence of night, but the oppressive silence of a city that didn't tolerate mistakes. Halle signaled the advance, and the team moved through the jagged terrain, their silhouettes hugging the ground, their steps timed with the soft rhythm of distant artillery so the vibrations masked their approach. They reached the first security contour in under 3 minutes. According to satellite intel, this area was supposed to be a radar dead zone, created by the accidental overlap between 2 Syrian anti-air systems. But what was theory on a screen in Langley became a different kind of truth on the ground. Halle watched the ripple of thermal grids moving slowly across the palace's outer perimeter. Thin, almost invisible waves designed to spot anything warmer than the surrounding air. Infrared sensors, hidden seismic plates, microphones buried under the gravel that could detect a cricket landing. It was a fortress made by someone who didn't trust his own shadow. The team switched to cooled suits, lightweight panels that reduced body heat signatures long enough to cross the danger zone. It felt unnatural, fighting against the body's instinct to warm itself. But instinct didn't win operations like this. At Hale's signal, they moved forward. 10 meters in, the team froze as a faint electronic buzz vibrated through the earth. Halle crochet, placing one gloved hand lightly against the ground. A buried seismic sensor, not on the satellite maps, not part of the known defenses. If they stepped incorrectly, they would trigger an alert that would wake the entire palace. Ricken wasn't an option. Time wasn't an option. Guessing wasn't an option. Halle leaned in close to the soil, studying the pattern of disturbed sand, the faint outline of something unnatural beneath it. Years of experience turned into instinct, and instinct turned into action. He pointed to the right, a specific stone barely visible in the moonlight, and rolled his hand forward. Follow this line. Every man stepped exactly where Halle stepped. One footprint wrong, and the mission would end not in the palace, but here, in the dirt, swallowed by darkness and silence. At the far end of the kill zone, the palace finally came into view. Not as a building, but as a silhouette carved into the hillside, its concrete walls gleaming faintly under the scattered light of Damascus. The structure was imposing, yet eerily still, like a beast resting with its eyes huffed. The infiltration point was an exhaust shaft concealed behind a line of decorative stonework. It wasn't on any blueprint. It was found only because one analyst noticed a slight heat signature misaligned with the palace's architectural symmetry. That tiny anomaly, spotted from 412 miles above, was now the SEALs' doorway into one of the most protected seats of power in the Middle East. Halle removed the great in-4 movements, each one controlled, deliberate, quiet. The interior of the shaft exhaled warm air, circulating the breaths of hundreds of men sworn to protect the president. They descended into the vent with cat-like precision, landing inside a narrow maintenance corridor lit by a single flickering bulb that made the tiled walls pulse with an uneasy glow. They were inside. This was the moment every operator knows. The moment the outside world falls away, and the mission becomes a self-contained universe where every sound, every breath, every heartbeat matters. Halle signaled for a halt, listening for patterns of movement. Footsteps echoed distantly somewhere inside the labyrinth. Sharp, controlled, armed. Not a patrol, a hallway guard rotation. Movement meant exposure. Exposure meant death. Halle pressed the team against the wall as 2 Syrian soldiers walked past the corridor intersection. Casual imposter, careless in timing. It would have been easy to eliminate them. But no U.S. signature didn't mean kill quietly. It meant kill nobody unless absolutely necessary. The SEALs waited like statues until the soldiers vanished around the corner. Only then did Halle motion forward. They followed the map projected against the back of Hale's mind. The mental reconstruction of the palace based on fragments, whispers, and intercepted communications. If the intel was wrong, they were walking into a dead end. If the intel was right, they were minutes away from discovering the chamber where the Syrians kept Asset Hiran. A man whose existence was not acknowledged by any government, yet whose death would change the balance of an entire region. At the end of the corridor, Halle stopped. A metal door stood before them, reinforced steel, double-locked, humming faintly with power. Behind that door was the reason they were here. Behind that door was the countdown that justified a 12-minute window. Behind that door was the Asset, who was supposed to be alive long enough to be saved. Halle reached for the breaching device, his expression unchanged, but his pulse beginning to align with the weight of what came next. The clock had started, and from here on, there would be no second chances. The metal door wasn't just reinforced, it resisted. Even before Halle touched it, he could feel the hum of electricity bleeding through its frame, the low vibration of a security system designed to warn the entire palace the moment anyone tried to breach it. This wasn't a storage room. This wasn't a cell. This was something far more deliberate. A vault. A place built not to hold weapons, but to bury secrets. Halle knelt, pressing his ear to the cold metal. Behind the door, he didn't hear guards. He didn't hear movement. He heard something far worse. The whisper of air cycling through a tiny pressurized chamber. A panic room inside a palace full of panic rooms. But this one had a purpose the others didn't. It wasn't designed to save someone. It was designed to hide someone. He pressed 2 fingers against the locking panel. Old Soviet circuitry, retrofitted with Iranian micro-relays. Crude, heavy, reliable. The kind of system that survived wars and whose alarms could wake an entire city block if triggered. They didn't have time for finesse. The entire mission depended on one fact. Once this door opened, the clock inside the palace would explode into life. He looked at his team, for men who understood everything he wasn't saying. He nodded once. Begin. They placed the charge a shape so small, it barely covered Hale's palm, yet precise enough to melt the locking mechanisms without shattering the frame. The explosive hissed as it reacted with the steel, and then the door sagged forward with the exhausted groan of something that had been holding its breath for too long. Halle pushed it open. The room was colder than the corridor, colder than it should have been for a building this close to the desert. The air stung the skin, artificial and controlled. The walls were padded, lined with soundproof panels, washed in a pale, clinical fluorescence that didn't belong anywhere near Damascus. And in the center of that sterile box sat a man, wrists bound, head lowered, breathing shallow and rhythmic, like someone who had already accepted he would die. Asset Hiran. Not a spy. Not an informant. Not what anyone expected. A was a high-ranking Syrian biochemist, one of Assad's own, the kind of man whose knowledge could erase cities or save them. And now Halle understood why the mission carried the weight. This wasn't a rescue. This was a race. The Syrians had plans for him. Plans that would end far beyond this palace. Halle approached slowly and lifted the man's chin. Hiran's eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion. But behind the haze was something harder, something intact, a mind that had not broken yet. "Are you able to walk?" Halle whispered. Hiran nodded once, but before he could speak, a shrill tone cut through the air. The door frame lit up red. The palace had detected the breach. Above them, muffled footsteps erupted. Not 2 guards, not a patrol. Dozens of boots pounding in unison. Reinforcements moving across marble floors, radios crackling, orders shouted in Arabic with urgency that made the walls vibrate. The palace was waking up. Halle grabbed Hiran, lifting him to his feet, ignoring the flinch of pain that cracked through the scientist's body. The team moved toward the exit, but as soon as they stepped into the corridor, steel shutters slammed down at both ends with bone-rattling force. They were trapped. The Syrians weren't responding blindly. They knew exactly where the breach had occurred. This corridor was a kill tunnel. Halle scanned the ceiling vents, wiring ducts, shadow lines. He found what he needed. A maintenance hatch barely big enough for a single man, never meant for anyone wearing gear, certainly not meant for a team with a hostage. But this wasn't a choice. It was the only direction left that didn't end in death. He pointed upward. The team understood instantly. They boosted Halle, who forced the hatch open with a grunt, dust raining down on them. Inside was a narrow crawl space carrying electrical conduits, a low, suffocating channel stretching into darkness. Boots hammered closer, shouts Sichu. Someone pulled a pin from a grenade. No more time. Halle reached down, grabbed Hiran by the collar, and hauled him upward with a force fueled by something more than muscle, the kind of strength men find only when failure has consequences bigger than death. One by one, the team climbed, collapsing into the stifling darkness above, just as soldiers filled the corridor below, flashlights slicing through the space where the SEALs had been seconds earlier. A grenade clattered on the floor below them. Halle didn't look down. He didn't need to. He pulled the hatch closed as the explosion ripped through the corridor, the shockwave punching the metal beneath his boots, the world shaking so violently it felt like the palace itself exhaled in fury. They crawled. The tunnel was barely wider than their shoulders, a metal throat that vibrated with the impact of each explosion. Each shouted order, each new layer of reinforcements converging on the floor below. Sweat blurred their vision despite the cold. The air burned with ozone. Hiran's breathing rattled behind Halle like a dying engine. Somewhere ahead, a distant alarm changed tone, a deeper, angrier sound. The Syrians had moved to Phase 2. Sealed the palace, seal every exit. Trap them inside. Halle kept crawling, faster now, pain scraping across every inch of his body. 12 minutes, that was the window. And the Syrians were already eating into it. This wasn't an escape anymore. It was a chase, a countdown without numbers, measured only by how hard the palace tried to kill them. And it was just beginning. The crawl space narrowed, shrinking until the metal pressed against Hale's shoulders, scraping his gear, threatening to pin him if he breathed too deeply. Beneath them, the palace roared alive, radios barking conflicting orders, boots stomping in chaotic waves, alarms pulsing through the walls like a racing heartbeat. The Syrians didn't know exactly where the intruders were, but they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone was inside the presidential palace, and someone had taken the man. Assad wanted buried. Halle reached a junction where the electrical ducts split into 3 directions. Sweat rolled down his face, stinging his eyes. He wiped it away with his sleeve, scanning the converging lines of conduits. One path angled sharply downward too steep. Another veered toward the interior chamber's suicide. The last one sloped toward the western wing, where, according to their fragmented intel, a maintenance ladder connected to the lower gardens. It wasn't an exit, but it was a direction. He motioned to the team and crawled into the sloping duct. The metal groaned under their weight, but didn't give. Hiran followed awkwardly, trembling with exhaustion, but still moving. Behind him, the SEALs shut the hatch to muffle their trail. Every movement, every scrape of fabric against the tunnel walls, felt like it echoed through the palace. The duct ended in a ventilation chamber barely large enough for 2 men. Halle dropped into it, landing silently, despite the height, and helped Hiran down. One by one, the team slipped inside, the chamber becoming a tight box filled with heavy breathing and the muffled sounds of chaos above. Halle pressed his ear to the wall. Footsteps. 6. No. 8 men. Moving fast. Too fast. They were converging directly over the duct. "We need Sugo now," Halle whispered. No one questioned him. The maintenance ladder was behind a rusted panel, secured with ancient screws. Halle pried it open with his knife, metal bending reluctantly. When he peeled it back, cold night air drifted inside, a welcome shock after the suffocating crawl space. The ladder dropped into darkness beyond the frame. He slung Hiran over his shoulder. The man was too weak to climb on his own. The team descended into the shaft, boots clinking against metal just softly enough to avoid drawing attention. Above them, a door slammed open. Voices echoed, flashlights cut through the ducts. They were seconds away from discovery. Halle signaled for silence, and the operators froze mid-descent as beams of light swept across the chamber above. A soldier tapped on the vent cover with his rifle, listening for movement. Another crouched and looked into the grate. For 2 full seconds, he stared at the darkness inside the duct. 2 seconds that stretched longer than the entire mission. Then clear. One guard shouted. They moved on. Halle exhaled silently and continued downward until his boots hit solid concrete. He lowered Huron gently. The shaft opened into a dim service corridor lit by a flickering bulb, the hum of diesel generators trembling through the walls. It wasn't in any blueprint they had seen. It wasn't part of the palace's known infrastructure. It was older, original, maybe dating back to when the complex was first built. It was also completely unguarded, a gift wrapped in shadows. The corridor led them toward a set of service doors. Halle pushed one open, revealing a sloped pathway that descended into the palace gardens. Moonlight spilled over manicured hedges and fountains that hadn't been turned on in years. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine, surreal, almost peaceful, like the city outside wasn't being torn apart by war. But peace died quickly. A spotlight snapped on from the far side of the gardens. A guard tower. Halle threw himself backward as the beam swept across the path they had just stepped onto. A Syrian sentry scanned the grounds with the bored precision of someone who expected nothing to happen but dreaded the moment it did. The team hugged the wall, bodies pressed against stone, hearts racing in sync with the slow rotation of the spotlight. Halle waited until the beam drifted left, then whispered, "Move." They sprinted, hunched low, shadows chasing shadows. The garden wasn't large, but it felt endless under that rotating eye. They reached a stone embankment overlooking a steep drop behind the palace, a cliff that marked the edge of the complex. At the bottom, a narrow access road twisted along the hillside. They were supposed to meet extraction on the far end of that road. But the radio was still dead. Halle pulled an infrared beacon from his vest, pointed it skyward, and clicked it on. It blinked invisibly, except to the sensors on the aircraft lurking miles away. If the pilot saw it, they had a chance. If he didn't, a burst of static crackled in Hale's earpiece. Then a voice, low and strained. "Raven 6, we have visual your lay." Halle didn't smile, but something in his eyes loosened. He clipped the beacon to his vest and signaled the team. They descended the embankment, half sliding, half running. Dust filled the air and loose stones clattered dangerously, but speed mattered more than silence now. Up ahead, headlights appeared, faint, filtered through sand and darkness. The extraction vehicle, a disguised technical driven by an undercover asset, jolted into view. The driver waved them forward urgently, but as the SEALs reached the road, automatic gunfire tore through the night. A Syrian response team had spotted movement. Bullets ripped through tree branches, stones exploded, and dirt erupted around them. Halle shoved Heron into the truck, then turned and laid down suppressive fire with controlled, precise bursts that pushed the enemy back just long enough for the rest of the team to climb aboard. The driver slammed the accelerator, tires screeching. Gunfire chased them as they tore down the hillside. Halle kept his rifle braced against the tailgate, firing into the darkness. Each burst calculated, each shot a barrier between life and the swarm of silhouettes emerging at the palace's edge. 12 minutes had felt impossible. Now they were running on seconds. The truck jolted violently as it hit the valley road, headlights cutting through rising dust clouds. Halle wasn't thinking anymore. He was calculating, adapting, living one microsecond at a time. Behind them, the palace alarms screamed into the open night. In front of them, the extraction zone waited, and above them, somewhere in the black sky, the silhouette of the aircraft prepared to pull them out before Syria's air defenses locked on. 12 minutes. A palace breached. A ghost rescued. A nation waking up to a crime it would never officially admit happened. Halle braced himself as the truck sped into the darkness. The window was still open, but rapidly closing. The truck hurtled through the lower valley like a wounded animal running on fear alone. Engine growling, suspension groaning under the weight of 7 men and 1 hostage who represented the kind of secret nations go to war over. Halle stood at the rear, his silhouette framed against the chaos they had just escaped. Firing bursts into the darkness to keep the pursuing shadows at bay. Each muzzle flash illuminated the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, but his movements remained precise, controlled, as if discipline alone was keeping him upright. Ahead, the valley road widened into a flat stretch of dirt, the perfect landing zone for the covert aircraft, but also the most exposed point in the entire region. The extraction window was closing. The Syrians were mobilizing faster than anyone expected. Flashlights glimmered along the hillsides. Engines echoed from the north. Radio intercepts crackled with orders to seal the border, to capture the intruders, to recover or eliminate Asset Hiron. The clock was no longer counting down seconds. It was counting down heartbeats. The aircraft arrived as a shadow. No lights, no sound until the very last moment, descending low enough that the rush of its rotors sent sand spiraling into miniature storms. Halle shouted for the driver to cut the headlights. Darkness consumed them. The pilot dipped the nose forward. Hovering so close, the downdraft shook the entire truck. A cable dropped, swinging dangerously in the turbulence. Halle grabbed Hiran, pulling him toward the extraction line, but the scientist could barely stand. His legs buckled under the strain of the escape. Halle threw Hiran over his shoulder and hooked the man's harness to the cable, tightening the latch with practiced movements. A single nod signaled the crew, and Hiran lifted into the air, rising into the belly of the night. Gunfire cracked from the ridgelines before Halle even turned back. Toward the truck, tracer rounds carved red lines through the darkness, stitching across the valley floor like burning threads. The truck's windshield exploded, glass scattering across the dashboard. The driver slumped sideways. The SEAL beside him pulled him out of the way and hit the gas with one hand, the steering wheel with the other. Halle hooked himself to the second harness, but before he could give the extraction signal, a missile launch lit up the northern ridge, a thin streak of white fire arcing into the sky. The pilot saw it. He didn't hesitate. The aircraft banked hard, engines screaming as it pulled Hiran clear of the missile's path. The explosion tore through the air behind them, the shockwave hammering the valley and throwing Halle against the truck. The rope swung wild, slamming into rock. Halle held on with both hands, boots dragging across the dirt, as sparks shot up from his gear, grinding against the ground. More gunfire erupted, bullets pinging off metal and stone. He had his team shouting, returning fire, covering him with the ferocity born from men who understood that one slip meant death. The pilot steadied the aircraft. The cable tightened. Raven says, "Asen? Asen?" The crew chief shouted over the comms. Though Halle could barely hear it through the roar, he lifted off the ground. 3 feet, 6 feet, then a round tore through his left thigh. Pain erupted like a shockwave inside him, white-hot and disorienting. But his hands didn't release the cable. He gritted his teeth so hard it felt like they might crack. The harness jerked upward again, dragging him out of the kill zone, away from the escalating chaos below, past the reach of the spotlights and rifles and shadows clawing for him from the ground. Below, the remaining SEALs piled out of the truck as it crashed sideways into the embankment, using the wreckage as cover while the aircraft shifted into position for their extraction. Halle watched from above, half conscious, the world tilting with each second. The gunfire sounded distant now, like thunder in another country. He saw one operator fall to his knees, then rise again firing, refusing to abandon his brothers. The cable dropped a second line. One climbed, then another, then another. The last man refused to hook in until everyone else was secure. He looked up, saw Halle watching, and raised his rifle in a final defiant salute before clipping himself onto the line. The aircraft pulled hard, lifting them all into the sky, just as a second missile streaked upward from the hillside. The pilot, gambling with physics and fate, banked the aircraft so violently that the horizon spun sideways, the missile slicing past the tail rotor by mere meters before detonating harmlessly above them. The world below shrank. The palace, the gardens, the cliffs, the roads, all dissolving into the patchwork of a city that had nearly swallowed them whole. Inside the aircraft, medics rushed to Huron first, then two. Halle, the bullet in his leg, had punched clean through, but blood pooled across the floor. He blinked slowly, fighting the darkness pressing against his vision. His team gathered around him, exhausted, bruised, out of breath, but alive. "You made it," someone murmured. Halle didn't answer. He just stared at the ceiling of the aircraft, the vibration of the rotors traveling through his bones, like a reminder that he was still here. Barely, but here. The aircraft turned west, back toward Jordanian airspace, where friendly radar would welcome them instead of hunting them. Below, Damascus sank into shadow, unaware of how close it had come to losing one of its darkest secrets. The official report was 4 pages long. 4 pages to summarize a mission that lasted 12 minutes on the ground and took years off the lives of everyone involved. No U.S. signature detected, asset recovered, operators exfiltrated under fire. Mission successful. No names, no details, no acknowledgement that the SEALs had infiltrated one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the Middle East. No mention that a single mistake could have rewritten the map of the region. Asset Huron disappeared into a classified program, resurfacing only in heavily redacted briefings that analysts weren't allowed to print. Damascus never admitted anything happened. The palace blamed a training explosion for the damage, and the world kept turning. As for Halle, he returned to the teams with a limp and a silence he carried for the rest of his career. Younger operators whispered about him, not because of medals or stories, but because of everything he refused to say heroes speak. Shadows don't. And missions like that demand shadows. Years later, when a new recruit asked him what it felt like to invade Assad's palace and leave alive, Halle gave the only answer that ever made sense. It wasn't 12 minutes. It was eternity, and then it was gone. And that was the truth behind the classified papers. 12 minutes, 1 palace, no signature, no witnesses, no second chances, the kind of mission that changes a man forever, even if the world never knows it happened.